The wind howled against the car windows as Emily Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The storm had hit harder than expected, turning the quiet back roads of her small town into an unforgiving whiteout. Snowflakes pounded against the windshield, thick and relentless, swirling in chaotic patterns under the glow of her headlights. The road ahead was nothing more than a blurred stretch of icy pavement, flanked by towering trees bending under the weight of winter's fury. It was late, too late to be out driving, but she had stayed longer at work than planned, and now all she wanted was to get home before the storm swallowed the road entirely. Her tires crunched over the packed snow, the rhythmic sound almost hypnotic in the eerie silence. The town was miles behind her now, and aside from the occasional flickering road marker, there was nothing but the dense forest pressing in from both sides. The world outside looked frozen in time, untouched, as if it had been abandoned to the storm. Then something shifted in the corner of her vision. A dark shape, just beyond the reach of her headlights. Emily's heart gave a sharp, unexpected jolt. She blinked hard, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her. Between the flurries of snow, there was someone standing near the tree line. No, not a person. She squinted, pulse quickening. It was too low to the ground, too still. A shadowed form, barely distinguishable against the whiteness of the storm. She eased her foot off the gas, slowing the car. The shape remained unmoving, half buried in the rising snowdrifts. A trick of the light? A fallen branch? But something inside her whispered otherwise. Her fingers tightened around the wheel as she leaned forward, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then, the headlights swept over it. Just for a moment. A dog. A large dog, its thick fur coated in snow, frozen stiff against the howling wind. Emily's stomach clenched. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay calm, but her mind was already racing. The animal wasn't moving, not a twitch, not a flicker of breath. For a heartbeat, she thought it might already be too late. But then, something about the way it sat, hunched and motionless, sent an uneasy chill down her spine. It wasn't just lying there, it was tied to the tree. Her pulse spiked. Who would do something like this? A dozen questions flooded her mind, but there was no time to process them. She looked down the road, empty, stretching into the storm. If she kept driving, no one would ever know. No one would come. But the thought of leaving made her sick to her stomach. Logic screamed at her to stay in the car, stay safe, keep moving. The storm was only getting worse. Stopping in the middle of nowhere, alone, was a terrible idea, and yet every instinct in her body told her she couldn't leave it behind. She hesitated for just a second longer, then she made her decision. Her foot slammed the brakes. The car skidded slightly before coming to a stop on the slick road. Emily threw it into park, her breath coming in short, fast bursts. The wind howled louder now, shaking the car as if it were warning her not to step outside. But she had already unbuckled her seatbelt, already pushed the door open. The cold was like a slap to the face. It stole her breath the second she stepped out, biting through her coat, her gloves, every layer of warmth she had. Snow crunched under her boots as she moved forward, her eyes locked on the motionless figure near the tree. "Hey, buddy." Her voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the wind. No response. She stepped closer, her heart pounding now, faster than it should have been. The dog's fur was caked in frost. Its body was slumped awkwardly, as if it had given up halfway through trying to lie down. Snow had piled up around it, half burying its legs, and the rope, the thick, rough rope, was wound so tightly around its neck, digging into its fur, frozen solid against the bark of the tree. Emily sucked in a sharp breath, rage flashing hot through her veins, despite the bitter cold. Someone had left it here. Someone had done this on purpose. Her hands curled into fists. The dog was so still, too still. A horrible thought crept into her mind. What if she was too late? Number She wasn't going to think like that. Swallowing hard, she dropped to her knees in the snow, ignoring the way it soaked through her jeans. Up close, she could see just how bad it was. The ice clung to its fur in thick patches, its whiskers coated in tiny frozen crystals. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath the thick coat. Had it been starving? Her hands trembled as she reached forward, pressing her gloved fingers gently against its side. For a second, nothing. And then, a faint rise and fall. Emily's breath caught. It was alive, just barely. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice tight with relief. "Hang in there, okay? I'm gonna get you out of this." But as she reached for the rope, her fingers brushed against something even worse. The rope was frozen solid, fused to the tree by layers of ice, locked in place like iron chains. It wasn't just wrapped around the dog's neck, it was dug into its skin, as if it had been here for far too long. Panic surged in her chest. She yanked at it, her breath coming fast, sharp. It wouldn't budge. It wouldn't move at all. Number. No, no, no. She needed something sharp, something to cut through it. Her gaze darted around wildly, searching for anything that could help. Her car keys. It was all she had. Emily ripped off her gloves, fumbling as she pulled them from her pocket. Her fingers burned from the cold the second they touched the metal. But she didn't stop. She jammed the key against the frozen knot, twisting, scraping, desperate to break the ice apart. The dog let out a weak, pitiful whimper. Emily froze. She looked up and met its eyes for the first time. They were dull, lifeless. But beneath that exhaustion, beneath the hollow emptiness, there was something else. A flicker. A spark of hope. And in that moment, she knew. It was still fighting. It wasn't giving up. And neither was she. The cold hit Emily like a wall the second she stepped out of the car. The wind howled through the trees, whipping snow against her exposed skin, sharp as needles. It cut through her coat, her gloves, like it was trying to drive her back inside, warning her not to interfere. But she wasn't going anywhere. Her focus was locked on the dog. It remained motionless, half buried in the snow, a dark shape against the pale white landscape. The closer she got, the worse it looked. Its fur was stiff with frost, ice clinging to every strand like it had been sitting there for hours, maybe even longer. Emily's breath came fast and uneven as she dropped to her knees beside it. The ground was so cold it burned through her jeans, but she hardly noticed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, gloved fingers trembling, pressing lightly against the dog's side. Nothing. No movement. No response. For a horrifying second, she thought she was too late. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, refusing to accept it. Desperation clawed at her as she pressed harder, this time holding her breath. Then, the faintest rise and fall. A weak, shallow breath. Relief crashed over her like a tidal wave, but it was fleeting. The dog was alive, but just barely. Her gaze dropped to the thick rope wound tightly around its neck. It was frozen solid, fused to the tree by thick layers of ice. The fibers had stiffened in the bitter cold, turning it into an unbreakable shackle. Worse, it was pulled so tight against the dog's throat that she could see where it had dug into the fur, where the skin beneath had been rubbed raw. Emily's stomach twisted. How long had it been like this? She didn't have time to wonder. She grabbed the rope and yanked as hard as she could. It didn't move. She tried again, gritting her teeth, pulling with every ounce of strength she had. The rough fibers bit into her palms through her gloves, but the rope didn't budge. It was like trying to break steel. "Come on," she muttered, frustration and fear rising in equal measure. The dog let out the softest, weakest sound, a barely audible whimper. Emily's throat tightened. She wasn't strong enough, she wasn't fast enough, but she couldn't give up. She had to think. Her gaze darted to the car, its headlights still cutting through the swirling snow. She needed something sharp, something to cut through the ice. Her pockets. What did she have? Her fingers closed around her keys. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Emily ripped off her gloves, not caring about the instant sting of cold against her bare skin. She jammed the key into the frozen knot, twisting, scraping, desperate to break the ice apart. Her fingers went numb almost immediately, but she didn't stop. The metal cut against the thick frost, flaking away small shards of ice, but the rope itself was still locked in place. She adjusted her grip, trying to wedge the key beneath the thick knot. It wasn't working. She needed heat. Emily let out a sharp breath, her mind racing. Then, without hesitating, she pressed her bare hands directly against the ice, holding them there, trying to transfer what little warmth she had left. Her skin burned. She clenched her jaw, ignoring the pain. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Her hands were shaking violently, but the ice was finally starting to melt. She dug the key in again, prying at the knot. The dog let out another weak sound, barely there, but that sound gave her hope. "It's okay," she murmured, voice shaking. "I've got you. Just hold on." A crack. The ice splintered just enough for her to get a better grip. Emily yanked at the rope again, this time twisting it, trying to force it loose. It still wouldn't give. She let out a frustrated breath, her eyes burning. She couldn't let this dog die here. Gritting her teeth, she used every last bit of strength she had left and pulled as hard as she could. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a sharp snap. The knot gave way. The rope unraveled, falling away from the dog's neck like broken chains. Emily barely had a second to react before the dog collapsed against her. Her heart stopped. It wasn't moving. "No, no, no!" She pressed her hands against its body, feeling for the weak rhythm of its breathing. A faint, uneven rise and fall. Still alive. Just barely. Emily exhaled shakily, relief mixing with adrenaline, but she wasn't done yet. The rope was gone, but the fight wasn't over. She looked down at the dog in her arms. Up close, it was even worse than she had thought. It was too light, far too light for its size. It should have been strong, solid. Instead, its frame was fragile beneath the thick, ice-crusted fur, starved, exhausted, barely holding on. Emily clenched her jaw, determination flooding her veins. "I've got you," she whispered again, pulling her coat tighter around its body. She didn't care how bad the storm was. She didn't care how cold she was. She wasn't leaving it behind. With shaking arms, she lifted the dog into her chest, holding it close, cradling it as if it were made of glass. She turned toward the car, the wind screaming in her ears, the snow blinding her. But she didn't stop. She staggered forward, every step an effort, her boots sinking into the deep snowdrifts. The weight in her arms was barely there. She had no idea if she was already too late, but she was going to fight like hell to make sure she wasn't. Emily barely felt the cold as she staggered toward the car, her arms wrapped tightly around the dog's frail body. Snow swirled around her, the wind howling, but she held on, shielding him as best as she could. His weight was alarmingly light, as if he were nothing more than a bundle of fur and bones. Reaching the car, she yanked the door open and carefully eased him onto the passenger seat. He didn't move. His breathing was so faint, so uneven. She could barely tell if he was still holding on. "Come on, buddy. Stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling as she pulled her thick winter coat off and wrapped it around him. His fur was stiff with ice, his body rigid from the cold. She turned up the heat to full blast, directing the vents toward him, desperate to push warmth into his frozen body. Her heart pounded as she reached out, resting her hand lightly on his side. His chest rose, barely. The realization sent a sharp pang of fear through her. He was getting weaker. Emily's hands tightened around the steering wheel as she threw the car into drive. She had to move. Now the tires spun for a moment against the icy road before finally gripping, and then she was speeding forward, her breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. The storm was unrelenting, sheets of snow slashing against the windshield, reducing her vision to nothing but a blur of white and the faint glow of her headlights. The town was at least 20 minutes away. 20 minutes. Did he even have that long? Emily clenched her jaw, forcing the thought away. She couldn't afford to think like that. She had to focus. Get there. Keep him warm. Keep him breathing. Her eyes flicked toward him every few seconds, searching for movement, for any sign that he was still fighting. But he remained motionless beneath her coat, only the faintest rise and fall of his chest reassuring her that he was still with her. "Just hold on, okay?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." The car skidded suddenly. Emily's heart lurched as the tires lost traction, sending the vehicle sliding sideways on the frozen road. She sucked in a sharp breath, knuckles white as she gripped the wheel, trying to correct the skid. The back end fish-tailed, the headlights flashing wildly across the snow-covered trees. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to spin out completely. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the tires found their grip again. The car jerked back into control, the momentum nearly sending her into the steering wheel. Emily exhaled sharply, her pulse hammering in her ears. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when every second counted. She risked another glance at the dog. He hadn't reacted at all. Her throat tightened. "Come on, buddy," she pleaded, reaching over with one hand, brushing her fingers against his fur. Still ice cold, still frighteningly still. Then a twitch. Emily's breath hitched. It was small, barely noticeable, but his paw had moved. A second later, a weak, broken whimper escaped his throat. Emily let out a shaky breath, relief crashing over her like a wave. "You're still here," she murmured, her eyes stinging. "You're fighting." Her foot pressed harder against the gas pedal. The storm raged on, the road stretching endlessly ahead, but she didn't care. She wasn't stopping. The snow thickened, the wind howling louder, but she kept going, pushing through the storm, her only thought on getting to the clinic before it was too late. Her mind was a battlefield, a war between hope and fear. Would she get there in time? Had she already lost too much time? "Don't give up on me," she whispered, her voice shaking. The dog didn't move again. Emily clenched her jaw, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. She wasn't going to let this happen. She pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing despite the treacherous conditions. The tires struggled against the slick road, but she didn't let up. Then, finally, a light in the distance. Her heart leapt. The clinic. A neon sign glowed faintly through the snow, flickering against the darkness. Emily's hands tightened on the wheel. Almost there. Almost. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had made it. Emily burst through the clinic doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body trembling from the cold and adrenaline. The warmth of the clinic hit her instantly, but she barely noticed. The only thing that mattered was the fragile, unmoving dog in her arms. "Help me!" Her voice cracked, urgent and desperate. "I found him in the snow. He's barely breathing. Please, he's not going to make it." A rush of movement. The receptionist shot up from behind the desk, and almost immediately, a side door flew open. Dr. Hayes, a tall woman in navy blue scrubs, strode out with purposeful urgency, her sharp gaze locking onto Emily and the bundle she cradled. "Bring him here," she instructed, already motioning for the vet techs to follow. Emily's arms ached as she carried the dog forward, but she refused to loosen her grip. She wouldn't let go until she absolutely had to. A metal examination table stood in the center of the brightly lit treatment room, its surface sterile and cold. Emily hesitated for half a second before gently lowering the dog onto it. The second she let go, her heart clenched. He looked so small, so impossibly still against the stark silver of the table. One of the vet techs pressed a stethoscope to his chest. Another wrapped a thermometer in a thin plastic sleeve before slipping it beneath his hind leg. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of machines and the faint scribble of notes being taken. Emily hovered at the edge of the table, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching every tiny movement. Her throat was dry. She wanted to ask something, anything, but the words refused to come. "Severe hypothermia," Dr. Hayes announced, her voice steady but grim. "Body temperature is dangerously low, too low for the thermometer to register." Emily's stomach twisted. She had known it was bad, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it so much worse. "Heart rate is weak, barely palpable," one of the techs added, his fingers pressing against the dog's frail chest. "Breathing shallow and irregular." Dr. Hayes gave a curt nod. "Let's move. Heated blankets, warm IV fluids, oxygen support, now." The team sprang into action, their movements quick and efficient. One tech rushed to retrieve thick, pre-warmed blankets from a heated cabinet. Another prepped an IV line, threading a small catheter into the dog's foreleg, securing it with gentle precision before connecting the tube to a bag of warmed saline. Emily flinched at the sight of the needle, but the dog didn't react at all. That scared her more than anything. "He's not responding," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "He will," Dr. Hayes reassured her, but there was a tension in her voice, a caution that made Emily's chest tighten. A clear oxygen mask was placed over the dog's muzzle. The machine hissed softly as it pushed warm, humid air into his lungs. Emily clenched her fists. She could do nothing but watch. The seconds dragged. Every shallow rise and fall of the dog's chest felt like an eternity. The vet techs moved with practiced efficiency, monitoring his vitals, making minor adjustments to the fluids and oxygen flow. The warmth from the blanket slowly, agonizingly slowly, started seeping into his frozen body. Emily's fingers curled into the hem of her sweater, gripping the fabric so tightly her knuckles turned white. Still no movement. No reaction. She held her breath. The clock on the wall ticked. 1 second. 2, 3. Then a twitch. Emily's eyes widened. Her breath caught. Had she imagined it? Another second passed. Then a faint, almost imperceptible shudder ran through his body. Her heart leapt to her throat. One of the vet techs noticed it too. "Dr. Hayes, I see it," the vet said, her sharp gaze never leaving the patient. "It's a good sign." Emily swallowed hard. She could barely move, barely breathe. Then, as if sensing the attention on him, the dog's eyelids fluttered. A tiny, weak movement. Almost nothing. But to Emily, it was everything. The room felt suspended in time. And then, finally, his eyes opened. Just a sliver, just enough to reveal a dull, glassy brown. His gaze was unfocused, hazy with exhaustion and confusion. But when he blinked, slow and barely there, his eyes found hers. Emily exhaled sharply, a choked sound escaping her throat. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her vision blurred, hot tears welling in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. He was still here, he was still fighting, and in that moment she knew. So was she. Emily sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The clinic was quiet now, aside from the occasional beep of a monitor from the back rooms and the hushed voices of the veterinary staff. She had been here for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been a short time since they had stabilized the dog, Max. That was the name she had given him in her mind, even if she didn't know if he had one yet. She exhaled, her breath shaky as she glanced toward the closed doors of the treatment area. Max had fought to stay alive, and now, finally, he had a chance. But there was something gnawing at the back of her mind, something that refused to settle. How had he ended up tied to a tree, in the middle of a blizzard. Who had left him there? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Dr. Hayes emerged from the back, her expression unreadable. Emily stood immediately, her heart hammering. "How is he?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "He's stable for now," Dr. Hayes reassured her. "We've managed to get his body temperature up and his vitals are improving. He's still weak, but he's fighting." Emily released a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't found him in time." Dr. Hayes nodded, but there was a hesitation in her eyes. "We scanned his microchip." Emily stiffened. "And?" "He had a registered owner." A cold weight settled in Emily's chest. "Had?" Dr. Hayes sighed, glancing down at the tablet in her hands. "The registration is still active, but here's the strange part. There were no lost reports filed. No one's been looking for him." Emily's stomach turned. That doesn't make sense. If someone cared enough to chip him, why wouldn't they try to find him? Dr. Hayes shook her head. "That's what I don't understand either. Usually when we scan a chip, it'll either show an owner who reported them missing or an outdated registration. But his file is current, and yet no one's claimed him." A creeping unease curled in Emily's gut. "Who is the owner?" Dr. Hayes hesitated, then turned the tablet toward her. Emily's eyes scanned the name, her breath catching slightly. She recognized it. Not personally, but it was familiar. A name she had seen before in town, connected to a local business. Someone well-respected. Someone who didn't seem like the type to abandon a dog in a storm. "Are you sure this is right?" Emily asked, frowning. "The database doesn't lie," Dr. Hayes replied. "But that's not the only thing I found." Emily's fingers clenched around the edge of the counter. "What do you mean?" Dr. Hayes gestured for her to follow. "Come with me." Emily's legs felt heavy as she trailed behind the vet through the quiet hallways, past doors leading to exam rooms and recovery areas. Finally, Dr. Hayes pushed open a door to a dimly lit room, where Max lay curled up on a soft blanket, his breathing slow but steady. An IV dripped fluids into his foreleg, and his body was still partially wrapped in thermal blankets. Despite the warmth in the room, a shiver ran down Emily's spine. Dr. Hayes knelt beside him and gently lifted one of Max's legs, revealing something Emily hadn't noticed before. A faint but deep scar running along the inside of his front leg. It was old, healed, but unmistakable. "This," Dr. Hayes said quietly, "isn't from an accident. It looks surgical." Emily swallowed hard. "Surgical?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "And look at this." She carefully examined Max's paw pads. "See how the skin is worn here? This isn't normal wear and tear. This is from rigorous training, running on rough surfaces, repetitive drills. And these calluses? They're common in working dogs, especially ones trained in security or law enforcement." Emily's mind spun. "You're saying he was trained for something?" "I'm saying," Dr. Hayes said carefully, "that he might not be just a regular house pet." Emily stared down at Max. The thought hadn't even crossed her mind before, but now it made too much sense. His malnourished body had distracted her from noticing the signs earlier, but now that she was looking closely, it was obvious. He had muscle memory of a dog who had been taught things, conditioned for things. 100 questions flooded her mind at once. If Max was a trained working dog, why was he abandoned? Why wasn't his owner looking for him? Emily rubbed her temples. None of this made sense. A person doesn't just forget about a dog like Max, especially not one that had clearly been part of something bigger. She took a deep breath, then hesitantly asked, "Do you think he could be a retired police dog?" Dr. Hayes pursed her lips. "Possibly. Or a private security dog, maybe even military. The scar suggests he might have undergone some kind of medical procedure related to his work. But without more information, I can't say for sure." Emily exhaled slowly, staring at Max's still form. She thought back to the storm, to the way he had been left, tied to a tree, left to freeze. If he had been a working dog, someone had trained him, relied on him. So what had happened, and why, when she had found him, had he been so utterly lifeless, like he had already given up? Her chest ached at the thought. Then something else hit her. The way he had reacted in the car, the small, barely noticeable flinch at certain sounds. She had dismissed it as fear, exhaustion. But now, it seemed like recognition. She licked her lips, then said, "I noticed something earlier, on the drive here." There were certain noises that made him twitch. It wasn't much, but it was like he was reacting to something familiar. Dr. Hayes straightened slightly. "What kind of noises?" Emily thought back. "The sound of my car tires skidding." He flinched. And when I spoke, he barely reacted. But when the radio turned on for a second, when the announcer spoke, it was like something flickered in his eyes, like he recognized the sound of a deep male voice. Dr. Hayes exchanged a glance with the vet tech. That could mean he was trained to respond to commands given in a specific tone or authority. Many working dogs are trained that way. Emily looked back down at Max, her stomach twisting into knots. What had he been through? And, more chillingly, what had happened that led to him being abandoned? Her instincts screamed that there was something more to this story, something bigger than just a dog left behind. But was she ready to find out? Because if Max had been a trained working dog, then there was a reason his owner hadn't come looking for him, and that reason might be something she wasn't prepared to uncover. The first few days after bringing Max home were filled with quiet uncertainty. Emily had made the decision without hesitation. There was no way she was letting him go back to whoever had abandoned him. But as she led him into her small home, the reality of what lay ahead settled in. Max wasn't just physically fragile. He was wounded in a way that went deeper than his body. She had set up a warm, cushioned bed in the corner of her living room, hoping he'd settle in. But he remained tense, eyes constantly darting to the doors, the windows, as if he expected something, or someone, to appear at any moment. He ate, but only in small bites, pausing every few moments to listen. He slept, but lightly, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. And worst of all, he never wagged his tail. Not once. It wasn't just fear. It was something more. A hesitation, a distrust that ran deep. Emily had rescued dogs before, strays, lost pets. But this was different. Max wasn't just a dog who had been abandoned. He had been broken. The first time she tried to pet him, he flinched, not out of pain, but out of habit. Emily's heart twisted. That first week she gave him space. She let him set the pace, never forcing affection, never demanding trust he wasn't ready to give. She worked from home as much as she could, keeping him within her sight, talking to him softly whenever she moved around the house. She wanted him to know he wasn't alone, but she wouldn't rush him. It took 3 days before he started following her. Not closely, just enough to keep her in his line of sight. A few steps behind when she moved from the kitchen to the living room, pausing in the hallway when she disappeared into another room, waiting until she returned. He was watching, observing, learning, and she let him. Then, on the 5th night, she woke up to a sound, a soft rustling near her bedroom door. Her breath caught as she turned her head, squinting in the darkness. Maximum. Lying near the doorway, his body curled tightly but facing her. He had moved on his own. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just let him stay. Little by little, Max began to change. At first, they were small things. His ears didn't stay pinned back constantly. His eyes softened. His body didn't stay so tense when she reached near him. Then there were the moments that made Emily hold her breath. The first time he willingly let her scratch behind his ears. The first time he let out a soft sigh of contentment as she draped a blanket over him. And then, the the first time he stepped closer instead of pulling away. But the real turning point came a week later, on a morning colder than most. Emily had taken Max outside, letting him explore the backyard, keeping her distance so he wouldn't feel pressured. He was still cautious, still watching her carefully, but he no longer hesitated as much. Then, it happened. She had been stepping back toward the house when her boot suddenly slipped on a patch of ice. Her body tilted, arms flailing, a sharp yelp escaping her lips as she lost balance. Before she even hit the ground, Max moved. Like a flash of light, he lunged forward, pressing his body against her, stopping her fall. Emily gasped, her hands gripping his thick fur instinctively. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not from fear, but from something else. Max had caught her. Emily slowly pulled herself upright, still holding on to him. And then, for the first time, Max looked up at her, and there was something different in his eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, something warmer, softer. Emily swallowed hard, barely able to breathe. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, his tail moved. Just the smallest flicker, barely there. But it was there. Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she smiled. Because in that moment, she knew. Max was beginning to trust her. That night, he curled up beside her couch instead of the farthest corner of the room. 2 nights later, he let her scratch his neck without flinching. And a week after that, he wagged his tail fully for the first time. It wasn't just a twitch. It wasn't hesitation. It was pure, genuine happiness. It was trust. And Emily knew. They had found each other. Not just by chance, not by accident, but because somehow they were meant to. The morning was crisp, the air tinged with the fresh scent of fallen leaves and the lingering chill of winter's retreat. Emily walked along the familiar trail that wound through the park, Max trotting beside her, his paws making soft imprints in the damp earth. The sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light on the path ahead. It had been weeks since she had first brought him home, and in that time, he had transformed from a fragile, haunted shadow of a dog into something more, something whole. His posture was different now. Where he had once moved with hesitation, always bracing for something unseen, he now walked with purpose. His ears perked at the distant chirp of a bird, his tail swayed gently as a light breeze ruffled his fur. It wasn't just that he was healing, he was starting to live again. Emily glanced down at him, a smile playing at her lips. "You like it out here, don't you?" she mused. Max didn't look up, but his ears twitched in acknowledgement. She knew he understood more than he let on. They had fallen into an easy rhythm on their walks, Emily talking, Max listening, both of them content in the quiet companionship they had built. But then, it happened. A man was walking toward them, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed as if lost in thought. Emily barely noticed him at first, just another passerby on a morning walk, until Max stiffened. It was so sudden, so complete, that it sent a chill through her. His entire body went rigid, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap, his ears flattened, his breathing hitched. Emily slowed, confusion twisting in her chest. "Max?" But he wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on the man ahead, unblinking, unshakable. The stranger was still a few steps away when he finally looked up, and froze. His eyes landed on Max, widening in pure, unmistakable recognition. Emily's stomach dropped. The man took another step forward, then stopped, his brows furrowing. "Is that—" His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something in it, something that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck rise. Max let out a low, almost inaudible whine. Not fear, not aggression, something else. Something deeply buried but now clawing its way to the surface. Emily instinctively placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the subtle tremor running beneath his fur. The man blinked, his expression unreadable, as if caught between disbelief and something darker. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the three of them. Emily swallowed hard. "Do you know him?" she asked hesitantly. The man's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered from Max to her, something unreadable passing over his face. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, he took a step back. He hesitated, exhaling sharply. I must be mistaken. But his voice didn't match his words. Emily didn't move. Neither did Max. The man took another step back, then another, before turning and walking away, a little too fast, a little too rigidly. Emily watched him go, her pulse pounding in her ears. Max remained frozen in place until the man had disappeared around the bend. Then, slowly, painfully, his body relaxed. Emily kneeled beside him, her heart racing. "Max," she murmured, brushing a hand gently over his fur. He didn't look at her. Instead, his eyes remained locked on the place where the man had stood, filled with something she had never seen before. Recognition, and maybe, just maybe, a memory trying to break free. Emily's chest tightened. That man had known him, she was sure of it, and more than that, Max had known him too. A shiver ran through her. There was something she wasn't seeing, something buried in Max's past that was slowly, inevitably rising to the surface. For weeks, she had been focused on his recovery, on helping him heal from whatever had happened before she found him. But now, for the first time, she realized. She might not have just saved Max. She might have stumbled into something far bigger than she was ready for. The past wasn't gone. It wasn't forgotten. And whatever had happened to Max before that night in the storm, it wasn't over. Max's story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a testament to the power of resilience, trust, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. It is about how broken souls can find healing in each other, how love and patience can mend wounds that aren't always visible, and how sometimes the ones we rescue end up saving us in return. From the moment Emily found Max in the snow, half frozen and abandoned, their journey together became one of redemption and second chances. Max had been left behind, discarded as if his life no longer held value. But Emily saw past his battered body and distant eyes. She saw something worth fighting for. And in doing so, she gave him more than warmth, food, or shelter. She gave him a reason to believe in kindness again. But healing is never instant, nor is it easy. Max didn't trust the world at first. Who could blame him? His past had left scars, both physical and emotional. Yet with each day, through quiet moments of patience and unspoken understanding, he began to open up. He learned that not all hands inflicted pain, that voices could be gentle instead of commanding, that a home could be a place of safety rather than confinement. And then, when Max made his first choice, to stand by Emily, to protect her, it was more than instinct. It was trust. But his past still lingers, waiting in the shadows. The encounter with the stranger proved that Max's story isn't finished, that the life he left behind may still be chasing him. Yet no matter what lies ahead, one thing is certain: he will never be alone again. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, the ones who have been abandoned become the ones who teach us the true meaning of loyalty, courage, and love. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.